question we get quite a bit on our website has, of course, to do with science. Has science eliminated the need for God? We are bombarded with documentaries all over the place on the Discovery Channel, the Science Channel, the History Channel, that basically says that science has eliminated the need for God. Is that true, Pastor Jane? Has that happened? Has science killed God?
Well, Nellis, that is a fantastic question, and you're right. We get that question all the time on our website, intelligentfaith315.com. And you see this a lot in popular culture as you listen to guys like Richard Dawkins, who used to be the professor of biology at Oxford University, and a lot of the new atheists. These are professors and authors who are very opposed to the idea of God and specifically the practice of Christianity. A lot of these men will say that science has progressed so far that God is an outdated idea, that we don't need the idea of God anymore, that science in some way has killed the idea of God, that science has eliminated the concept of God from being necessary. And that is really just not true. Science is not the foe of Christianity, it's the friend. Science is not contradictory to the Christian faith, but rather complementary. Listen to the words, Nellis, of the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans about 2,000 years ago. In Romans chapter 1, Romans 1:19, speaking of the non-believer, they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. Of course, the obvious question is, well, how has he made it obvious? He continues in verse 20, because ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything that God has made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. And so this is a fascinating verse here. He says through everything that God has made, people can clearly see some of God's invisible qualities. In other words, Scripture tells us very plainly, Old and New Testament, that from the visible, physical, created world, as we look at the sky, as we look at the earth, as we look at human bodies, and then of course today, as we look at different aspects of modern science, that these should actually be testifying to us of God and speaking to us about God, not eliminating his idea from our minds or trying to contradict what Scripture teaches. And Nellis, this is amazing. This is actually what we do discover. It is true that modern science is exactly that. It's modern. Science is a very new phenomenon. It's only in the last couple hundred years where this enterprise of modern science has really taken off. And Nellis, as we mentioned in one of our previous programs, the founding fathers of the modern scientific movement were to a large degree, a majority of them were Christian believers and Christian theists. And so the modern enterprise of science was birthed from men like Louis Pasteur and Johannes Kepler and Blaise Pascal and Francis Bacon. These men were devout, devoted Christian believers, or men like Isaac Newton. And even though he wasn't a Christian, Albert Einstein did believe in a version of a creator. So many people don't even believe this or understand this from history, that the modern scientific enterprise really was birthed in a culture of Christianity, that these men of God were wanting to discover how God did it and the mechanics of how God constructed reality, and that was their motivation in their scientific discovery. But since modern science has happened, Nellis, we're at a place today where we know more about physics and astronomy and biochemistry and biological information. We know more about many of these areas of scientific study than ever before. And the fascinating thing, Nellis, about many of these areas of scientific discovery is that many of them point powerfully and persuasively to the existence of God. Another fascinating area is the area of biochemistry. Now this, Nellis, is where scientists look into the microscope. They look into the world of microbiology, of cells, of bacteria, of these small organisms that we didn't used to understand a lot about. But with today's level of technology, we know more about them than ever before. There actually is no such thing as the simple cell. So your listeners, whenever you hear that expression, the simple cell, on the Discovery Channel or perhaps in a university classroom, there is no such thing as the simple cell. As a matter of fact, the cell is so complex. If you could imagine perhaps a gigantic spaceship in outer space, maybe the USS Enterprise or something of that nature. If you could imagine a gigantic spaceship in outer space, and then you were to come inside the spaceship, look around, and if everything that you saw inside the spaceship was automated and it was full of robots running around doing different jobs, building things, breaking things, transporting things, moving things, if there was an incredible computer information system running the entire spaceship automatically, well, you would never assume that that kind of an amazing design happened all on its own through random accidental process. Well, Nellis, that actually is what you would see if you blew up a human cell to the size of a spaceship. Inside the human cell, there are multitudes of automated little micro machines called proteins, and they go around building things, breaking things, moving things, transporting things. So there really is no such thing as the simple cell. But you see, Darwin didn't know that. Back in his day, his level of technology was so low, he thought, as you said, that the cell was just a glob of jello, basically a little piece of protoplasm. And Darwin, he actually said this, though, a very interesting quote from Charles Darwin. He said, quote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." So it's really good for you as the listeners to know that Charles Darwin admitted that if we could ever demonstrate that there was a small, tiny biological organ that could never have come about by small successive changes, Charles Darwin admitted the theory of evolution just couldn't actually be true. Well, what actually is the case is that in our modern day and age, biochemists such as Michael Behe have demonstrated exactly that through their description of what they call irreducibly complex molecular machines. So Michael Behe has published a wonderful book back in 1996, but it's still very hot today, called Darwin's Black Box. A black box is something that we don't understand. A black box is something that's beyond our level of technology, and we can't really understand it in its fullness. The cell was a black box to Charles Darwin. But through biochemists like Michael Behe and the discipline of microbiology, we understand now, as we said, that inside the cell are what we call molecular machines. And that's just not a cute little phrase. These are actual machines at the molecular level, thousands and thousands of molecular machines like the bacterial flagellum or the ATP synthase that are inside of the cell, Nellis. And these kind of devices could never have come about through random accidental processes. So I do encourage you listeners, if you're into science, if you want to get some good information, to go to Amazon.com and check out a book, Darwin's Black Box. This phrase, Nellis, that Michael Behe invented called irreducible complexity, what it means is that there's molecular machines inside of our cells, and if we remove just one part from any of these molecular machines, the machine itself wouldn't be functional anymore. They're irreducible, that you cannot strip away any of their parts. So it's impossible for them to have come about by a slow, gradual process of evolution. Some of these complicated microscopic machines would include things such as cilia and the bacterial flagellum. They are extremely unlikely to have been built in a piece-by-piece process through Darwinian evolution because they have to be fully present, fully put together in order to function. Other examples include the incredible system of transporting proteins in the cell and the intricate process of our blood clotting. So as you can see, Nellis, there's evidence of physics, evidence of astronomy, and evidence of biochemistry that all points powerfully and persuasively to the reality of God having created us and designed us. But probably the most amazing piece of information is DNA. There's a lot of scientists today that aren't Christians, but they also know that the DNA molecule, which is the most complicated molecule in our bodies, as you said, it's impossible for it to have come about by the random combination of chemicals. And many of the scientists today, they believe that it was designed by aliens. And the reason they say that, though that sounds a little funny, is because they know that it had to be designed by an intelligence, by an engineer, by a designer. But of course, they refuse to believe in God. And so there actually is a very respected theory in the university today called cosmic panspermia. And these are people that believe that aliens are the ones behind the design of human life and behind the design of the DNA molecule. So, as you said, Nellis, the DNA molecule is just fascinating. It was the structure of the DNA molecule was discovered in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick. And as most of you listeners know, if you can think back to a picture of DNA, it's in the shape of a double spiral helix. So this is kind of like a staircase that is twisted upon itself, and it just turns and turns and turns. The DNA molecule is 3 billion pairs of nucleotides long. That's a huge amount of information. So the DNA molecule is made up of 4 different nucleotides, A, C, T, and G. Adenosine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. And there's 3 billion pairs throughout the course of the DNA molecule. This is an incredible amount of information. And so the DNA molecule, Nellis, as we would say, the hardware is very impressive. A lot of our listeners have computers or tablets or cell phones, and we're impressed today with hardware, with machines that can do amazing things. And certainly the DNA molecule is a piece of hardware that is absolutely phenomenal. Bill Gates has been quoted as saying that the DNA molecule is the most advanced information storage and retrieval system in the world, and that we will never be able to build something with the same capabilities as the DNA molecule has. It's an information storage and retrieval system. The DNA molecule, Nellis, it's amazing. It actually has backups within it, to where if one part of the molecule malfunctions, that there are 2 or 3 versions of that section, and these can just turn on, and the DNA molecule won't malfunction. That's called redundancy. And as you said, the most amazing thing, Nellis, about the DNA molecule isn't the hardware, but actually it's the software. It doesn't have something like a language. It actually has a real language, a real code of information within it. And as you said, wherever there's a code, there has to be an encoder. Wherever there's a language, there has to be an author of that language. And anywhere we see in the universe information, we know that there has to be a mind, a thinker, an author behind the information. It doesn't just have to be something complex like a computer code. It can be something as simple as waking up in the morning and seeing that there's handwriting on your bathroom mirror, for example. Any of our listeners, if they would have woken up this morning and seen written on the mirror of their bathroom, "I was here" in lipstick, you would never assume that happened by random chance. A message like that must come from an intelligence, from a mind. And so if we can see a message like that, or walking on the seashore, and we can see that Sally loves Harry written in the sand, if we know from our experience that messages like that have to come from a mind, why would we ever think that the 3 billion pairs of nucleotide code and language would not come from a genetic designer and thinker? That is powerful and persuasive evidence that we have indeed, as Scripture tells us, been wonderfully and majestically designed and engineered by God Himself. As we see in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, that man was made in the image of God. They were actually created and designed by God Himself. And this isn't just a belief that we have to accept on blind faith, or even just in the Scriptures. We see that there's physics and astronomy, biochemistry, biological information that points to this reality. Well, that's all the time we have for today's program. Thanks again for joining us at Intelligent Faith. We hope you'll come back next week and join us again as we seek to answer your questions, your doubts, and even your objections to the Christian faith. Intelligent Faith is a teaching ministry of Calvary Chapel of Puerto Rico. You can call our offices at 787-720-3308. Also to encourage you to check out our website at intelligentfaith315.com and go ahead and send us your questions at intelligentfaith315@gmail.com. Hope you'll come back again and join us next week. Until then, God bless you and have an intelligent faith.